Good afternoon. My name is Brian Denny from the Rail Maritime and Transport Union. We represent 8,000 transport workers in Britain, rail workers, bus workers, ferry workers and taxis, and we're very biased, I'm afraid. We have a view on the state of the world. Our General Secretary sends greetings to this meeting. He wanted to come. He's got great interest in the legacy of Desmond Greaves, but it's the TUC this weekend, and he sends his apologies. Our AGM met in July, and we had two motions on the Wednesday afternoon. One was for the in support of Irish reunification, and the next motion was for complete British withdrawal from the European Union. I think the spirit of Desmond Greaves was with us that afternoon, and it was unanimous. And I just want to talk about why that's the case and why it is unique in Britain. We have that position, unfortunately, at the moment. Firstly, I think it's great to be here. It's a very high level of debate, and it makes my life easier because a lot of what I was going to say has already been said. Particularly last night, the Icelandic former finance minister was fascinating about the nature of capital, and I want to deal with a bit of that. But also Tom Connor said something about social partnership. I want to start on that because I first got introduced the ideas of social partnership, Desmond Greaves, when as a young shop steward I was sent on a union course 20 years ago. And I think Tom Connor would recognise what happened to me, because on the Monday we talked about role play, about negotiating skills, about negotiating wages, disciplinaries. On the Wednesday morning, a very sinister thing happened about 1990. A fellow walked in from our education department, and he walked in and he put an EU badge on every desk. And he said, "Lads, it's over, it's finished. The class struggle is finished. Now we have something called social partnership." Extraordinary, really, because apparently now, overnight, I was a partner with my employer, and I knew the fellows on in my print shop didn't see him as a social partner. I'm not talking about official social partnership like you have in this country. I'm talking about the aspiration towards it. In other words, if we accept flexibility, then we will have full employment and all the rest of it. And the vehicle to do this was going to be the European Union. If the trade union movement would only embrace the idea of social partnership and the concept of trade unionism as a partner with business to develop a thing called the European Union. Everyone at that course was absolutely stunned because they'd never come across this before. And I think it was an example of early sort of the ideas of postmodernism hitting people in the face, and they just could not deal with it, and they weren't equipped to argue against it. And I think that's what's paralysed the trade union movement in the intervening 20 years. Fortunately, I knew someone who knew something about Desmond Greaves. The campaign against Eurofederalism had been set up, and the work of John Boyd. And he was interested that Desmond Greaves said the EU would lead to war abroad and fascism at home. I mean, that's a different vision altogether. And someone was lying to us, and I think people still are lying to us. And what's incredible in Britain, as the TUC meets, they still think they're social partners. But what's incredible, no British employer wants to be a social partner with them. So it lives in a complete fantasy world, not accepting the desperate situation that we find ourselves in. And the idea that the class struggle has come to the end of history, the end of the nation state, and ultimately the end of rationalism itself. And I think that's the point we're at. I think the main driver of this counter-revolution is finance monopoly capital, and it's seeking to free itself from all the democratic constraints that's been put on it over the last 150 years. And that's what the European Union is there to do. It seeks to hand all public services to finance capital and treats workers and industrial capital, for that matter, as commodities to be exploited. And they do this by imposing the four freedoms onto us: the complete freedom, free movement of capital, goods, services and labour, thus removing all democratic controls on capital. And it's led directly to this crisis, as other speakers have alluded to this morning, and of course, and even last night. It's also reignited interest in the ideas of Karl Marx. at the same time, who had a definite view on what finance capital was. He described it as fictitious capital, based on trading debts and trading the money that didn't exist. And he even had a code for it: MCM, money, commodity equals more money. That's industrial capital, and M to M is money to money. And it's parasitic, it's destructive, and ultimately it's irrational. And he truly believed, because it was irrational, it would disappear. And there was an interesting quote from Karl Marx: "The entire artificial system of forced expansion of the reproduction process cannot, of course, be remedied by having some bank, like the Bank of England, give all the swindlers the deficient capital by the means of its paper and have it buy up all the depreciated commodities at the old nominal values." That's exactly what's happened over the last 2 years, the complete opposite of what Karl Marx thought was a move towards rationalism and a more sane way of running the world. I mean, this rejection of rationalism is a manifestation of the economic crisis that we find ourselves in. And even at this moment, the European Union is using the Lisbon Treaty to grab all the remaining economic powers that are left to the member states, to EU institutions. On Wednesday, the EU finance ministers agreed, and that included George Osborne, who was elected on a semi-Eurosceptic ticket, ironically enough. And it was agreed that all EU budgets will be coordinated and supervised next year. And all national budgets will be monitored so as to detect any inconsistencies and emerging imbalances. Now, next month, the spending review, George Osborne will have a bonfire of public services and cuts of up to 40% that are already devastating our public services. The EU Economic and Monetary Affairs Commissioner, Olli Rehn, he said it this way: he said there will be sanctions on any country that then puts in a budget that is not agreed by the Commission, and that is in the Lisbon Treaty, a complete centralisation of control of spending. So it becomes almost irrelevant what the makeup of the national government is. And he even used a fatuous analogy, which EU officials are apt to do, and he said the European Union is a bit like a football game. It won't work if the players start to discuss and argue the rules of the game with the referee every time they commit a foul. So member states of the EU are reduced to footballers who kick a ball around for 90 minutes and then they go back away, and the real power lies with the referee, who decides what's going to be privatised and what democratic rights are going to be removed this week. All this process was drawn up by the European Roundtable of Industrialists 25 years ago with the drawing up of the Single European Act. It was all written into there, and the ERT are made up of the biggest corporations, made up of finance capital in Europe, and their clear remit is to promote EU integration to the benefit of finance capital. They even have a website that says that. They openly say, at a European level, the ERT has contacts with all the European bodies, the European Council, the Commission, and they even bobble with the Parliament, as if it's got any powers to do anything anyway. It was set up in 1983 with the express mission to carry out this vision. And the Wise Decker, the Philips CEO, who set it up, said, if we wait for our governments to do anything, we'll be waiting for a long time, and you can't get tied up in politics. Industry must take the initiative. There is no other way. And he told 4 Philips consultants to say, this is what you must do. You must impose this economic straitjacket on the whole of Europe. And he even said to them, imagine yourselves to be the dictators of Europe and that you decide that the job must be done in 5 years. Once they picked up this idea, they found it fascinating, and they discovered in fact that it could be done given the political will. Pure corporate power imposing itself on the European Union just at a moment when actually all the member states had rejected the ideas of an internal market in 1984, and then Margaret Thatcher came in with Lord Copcroft and set up the Single European Act, which envisaged a single market, the European Army, the Euro, and everything else we've got. Interestingly, it was imposed by Jacques Delors, a supposedly social democrat, not the rest of it. And he made a speech introducing the Single European Act, and at exactly the same moment he launched Social Europe. Social Europe, the social chapter, the idea of social partnership, at exactly the same time. The European Roundtable of Industrialists supported that move because it sweetened the pill. The ERT Secretary General, Keith Richardson, said at the time, "We do not mind about social Europe as long as it remains an aspiration, a smokescreen. It will not produce jobs and will not get in the way of the development of corporate Europe." So the ERT had achieved its aims, and today the European Union is more or less a state in its own right. It's a corporate model dominated by monopoly finance capital, which sees shareholders as the main beneficiaries. And finance capital is not only at war with labour, it is at war against productive industrial capital. And this is not a new model, this is a very, very old model. In fact, it's a medieval model. And I think to highlight this fact is that we take a look at the first global corporation. It was called the English East India Company. And it was set up in 1600 by a group of merchants who incorporated themselves to get off Queen Elizabeth I monopoly privileges over trade in the East Indies. By the time it was nationalised by the British Crown in 1848, it had become a byword for brutality, greed and corruption, with the unusual distinction of actually ruling entire areas of the globe as a company. It had given itself the right to mint coin, to impose laws and punishments, to wage war with its own private army, and most importantly, it actually reversed the trade patterns between Britain and the rest of the world and turned it from a consumer into a producer. Because the East India Company was a cartel with nothing to trade. All it had was its army, and it traded in debt exactly the same way as Enron did, and all the other corporations. It traded in insurance. It was chaotic. It collapsed periodically. Had to be propped up. First of all, it moved into spices, then textiles, and then of course it moved into drug dealing, opium. And it forced the Chinese to be drug addicts for centuries. It forced two opium wars because the Chinese had the temerity to make heroin illegal, and the John Company then moved on militarily. The company saw its fortunes rise into a ruling enterprise with the Robert Clive of India. He launched the Battle of Plassey, famously defeating the Nawab of Bengal. And the way he did this was actually to pay off the army beforehand and make them so they could run off. Another sort of shrewd business move that was. But what was interesting is that then Clive was given the right to raise taxation across Bengal. I mean, you've got to bear in mind, Bengal at that period was one of the most productive areas on earth. A very sophisticated economy, produced a lot of textiles, and over the next 5 years, Clive was given the right to collect all taxation, and he actually owned the treasury in Bengal, and he became the richest man on earth from being a clerk after that battle. So the clamour in East India Company shares ballooned, and it led to the Bengal bubble. But not before the company hired hundreds of ships. It took 5 years to empty the coffers of the Nawab. 5 years and thousands of ships. In that time, they used British sailors, but then they got rid of them, and they used Bengali sailors, and they were called Lascars. Couldn't speak English, barely clothed. And they sailed the ships to the East India dock, unloaded the gold, gave them to the shareholders. The shareholders were getting 1,000% by this point. The sailors were then abandoned at the dock in a massive social dumping exercise where they just abandoned them. And it was a scandal of Georgian England that there was 10,000 Lascars abandoned in East London. When the barbarity of it is beyond belief, and actually because of this outrage, they actually shipped them back to not to Bengal. They shipped them to Sierra Leone because it was cheaper. They left them on the beach. It got worse after that. They then destroyed the economy of Bengal to the point where a third of the population died of starvation. It's up to 10 million people died. while the shareholders were doing very well. And the company servants were a very rapacious lot as well. And by the end of it, Bengal then became a big area for growing opium to then be shipped to China. The profits from that led to a big tea boom the East India Company made more money out of. And you can see how it goes on, this whole cycle of insanity and greed without any kind of governance at all. I mean, I say that because, interestingly, by the Victorian period, the 1848, the East India Company was actually dissolved, and it's because it was such an embarrassment, it was such a byword for brutality, corruption, and venality that it had to go, and it actually disappeared from history, and obviously the Crown took over the India and all the rest of it. I say this because it's very important, because in 2002 the story of the East India Company emerged again in the British Library. The British Library is the most prestigious library in England. The banks took over to put on an exhibition of the East India Company called Trading Places. And it's quite incredible that 14 banks put the money in and said, and this is what they said about the East India Company: "It is now necessary to build on the courageous, creative and truly international legacy of the East India Company, as it is a case study in hard work, shrewdness and charm." So what I'm saying is, today finance capital wants to emulate what the East India Company done so efficiently and so brutally over many years, except that this time they're not building an empire abroad, they're building it here. It has its own currency, it has its own army. It's not Asia, it's in Europe, because they don't want to be nationalised again. They've learnt the lesson that that's the model, but we're not going to have some government telling us what to do. So I was going to say a lot more about that, but I think the other point I wanted to make: why does that interest the trade union, this history lesson? Because we have been privatised. We are now in the public, we're more or less a private sector union. We used to be a public sector union. And we are not social partners with our employers. They are vicious exploiters, and they want to crush us as a trade union. And I think they want to do that internationally. And the way they're doing that within the European Union is to regulate activities through the European Court of Justice, through the judgments, which effectively outlawing collective bargaining in the member states, increasing social dumping by encouraging low-wage economies to import labour, and to break the self-defence mechanisms of the working class. Recently it's got a lot worse. David Cameron was in India, getting back to the East India Company. He was in India 2 months ago negotiating something called Mode 4. He was in India, but Mode 4 wasn't put in the media. Now what Mode 4 is where international, transnational corporations can bring in their own labour to any member state of the European Union under the trade agreements and pay Indian rates of pay, or wherever it comes from. That's what Mode 4 is. It's the physical movement of natural persons to a member state to work for a limited period of six months, no trade union rights, no rights whatsoever, on very low wages, to the point that when the 6 months is up, they can then be moved on. And to do this, they're being encouraged, the corporations are also being encouraged with tax exemptions and all the rest of the benefits of having flexible labour. So it is a very grim situation. And I think our problem, as Tom Connor is absolutely right, is to do with social partnership and weakening the organised working class against this drive for endless profit. And I think I want to end on the fact that I was talking about at the beginning, was about Desmond Greaves, is that progressive forces, people have been talking about how we're going to respond to this. We must defend and restore national democracy. Trade unions invented democracy. We are the makers of democracy. Before trade unions, there wasn't any democracy. That's why corporate power, finance capital, fictitious capital doesn't like trade unions, because we historically represent democracy. And national independence should once again play a decisive role in the defeat of a parasitic class which has no interest in the people that live in its country. And the finance capital in Britain and Ireland has abandoned its people, and we have to take up the mantle of national independence and democracy again. Otherwise, we're in for a very hard run. And I think Karl Marx said it himself: capital is reckless of the health and length of life of the labourer, unless it is under compulsion from society. And if unfettered capital will crush us, we have to be quite clear about that, and we have to take that message into the labour movement and say we're not accepting being managed. A managerial business model of trade unionism doesn't work anymore. It is not going to be enough to resist the onslaught, and it must be in tandem with social forces, and to take back the democracy and restore the historical role that the working class has as being the defenders of democracy, and to control capital and all that flows with that. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. My name is Michael Smith. I wasn't really sure what precisely to say given the diverse backgrounds of the previous speakers and the breadth of the topic, complicated by the fact that it extends to two different jurisdictions, Ireland and the EU. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Anyway, in general, I guess it's probably most productive if you feel free to interrupt me, and we'll try and make this something of a dialogue. Anyway, the issue of the afternoon is who really makes policy in Ireland? So the answer is easy, of course. It's Fianna Fáil and rich people and multinationals. So above all, rich Fianna Fáil people representing multinationals. Lobbyists, Frank Dunlop, PJ Maher, Martin Mackin, you know the type. I hope I haven't peaked too early here. but maybe that's just a scandalous hunch. Perhaps the people who really make policy are just too powerful for it to be possible to nail them, just too elusive, too disparate, too clever. And in any event, when considering this topic, I was divided, I suppose, overall as to whether lobbying is primarily about individuals or about class interests. Is lobbying best analysed as lobbying for themselves or for their extended interest or class? And of course there may be a difference between national and European approaches on this. It seems unlikely that individuals are successfully influencing European policy in their individual private interests. The place is too big, too bureaucratic and too self-righteous. But of course in Ireland many notable individuals have done just that. So the topic of the afternoon is a little bit dry, so I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about my own experience. I'm going to talk about planning corruption, planning, Docklands, the Millennium Mall, and a little bit about Village Magazine. I'm also going to assume that there's a difference between who makes the policy and who benefits from the policy. The aspirant classes who vote Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and multinationals benefit, would be my conclusion, or at least are intended to benefit until now have benefited. But it's probably a somewhat different crowd, I theorise, who actually make the policies, embracing the media, civil servants, property developers and bankers, the money classes and aggressive individual lobbyists, famous, infamous and unknown. But to be honest, thinking about the whole issue, it's all a little bit messy, primarily because of the anarchic, non-ideological, messy leviathan that is Fianna Fáil, who of course are central to any discussion of an issue like this. I'm also going to look at Brussels. How much policy does it make, and how much lobbying goes into those policies? And my conclusions will be fairly simple on the topic. That there's a need for compulsory registers of lobbyists both in Ireland and in Europe, with very strong disclosure requirements for the people who do register. So my own experience, my first entry into the political process was in 1989, when I discovered that the Dublin County Council, as it was then, and Monarch Properties were planning to destroy thousands of areas of idyllic farmland beside where I'd grown up in Lochlinstown, on the side of the Braille Dual Carriageway there. But although I'd long since left Lochlinstown, I was enraged. I couldn't believe that they were going to do it. For various reasons, it seemed at the time, even in theoretical planning terms, that it was the wrong part of the city to be developing when there were the new towns to be completed and so on. Anyway, I got together a bunch of 6 of my buddies who I'd grown up with, in the area, including Eamon Ryan and now former Senator Deirdre de Burke. And we turned out week after week, like guerrilla flying columns in the rain, countering the developers' slick and expensive propaganda for this development, which they were touting in school halls with very large models, saying they were going to build Tiernan Oak, Happy Valley, and we were countering it, saying that actually all they intended to do was to sell the land once they got the rezoning, and that they were given no guarantees at all as to what they would build. But as part of that process, we became heavily immersed in the process. We were following the developers around very assiduously, and we saw a number of dodgy dealings, chief of which was when the developer himself told me that he was bribing councillors and how he was sure that he would get his rezoning in the end. As you'll understand, that made a big impression on me. Anyway, in 1991, after the end of the battle, we actually stopped the rezoning. We actually got the land downzoned, and we felt it was a Herculean achievement, bearing in mind that we were just an anarchic troop of people in their mid-20s. And the developer had spent €500,000 in today's money propagandising for the zone. They even had TV ads for this rezoning, and attacking us in the most personal terms on leaflets that they shoved through the letterboxes all over the south side of Dublin. Anyway, we'd won, except of course that there was another round. Most of the residents by that time had lost their energy. Councillors cynically bided their time and then pushed through the rezoning at the last minute. But the extraordinary thing about this was that they did it in exactly the sequence that the developer had told me, and even the pattern of who had changed their mind was exactly what he'd said would happen. And of course, between them voting against the rezoning and the zoning actually going through, one of the most notable differences was that Modern Properties had employed Frank Dunlop. So anyway, we were distraught after a year wasted campaigning against this rezoning. We went being fresh-faced young things through all the hoops, writing to ministers, getting worthy articles in the national newspapers, etc., etc. But in the end, it became clear that the decision couldn't be disturbed. The policy was going to be to build. So I was sort of obsessed. I'm not quite sure why, but anyway, I was obsessed about this issue, having spent so much time on it, I suppose, and I discussed it widely with people and what we could do about it. And in the end, a friend of mine, Colin McGuckie, and I settled on the anarchic idea, I suppose, of offering a reward about planning corruption. So we put an ad in the main newspapers offering €10,000 for information leading to the conviction of persons for rezoning corruption. And I won't bore you, but we had to do it through a Newry solicitor, because not a single solicitor in this jurisdiction would touch the case. But anyway, we offered the reward, and quite soon we had a flow of information. Some of it was rubbish. I think we had reports of the whereabouts of Shergar's body, but clearly not all of it. What we did, when an informant came to us with information, we were in no position to say whether the information was true or publishable. But what we do is we would just drip feed it to journalists, and they could make a decision talking to the informant as to whether it was something that was fit to be published. And amongst the people who came to us were James Gogarty, with allegations about Ray Burke, the then Minister for Foreign Affairs. And of course, in the end, Burke resigned because the allegations proved to be true. The flood, now the Mahon Tribunal was instigated to look into the allegations, and in the end, I suppose, it led to ultimately to Bertie Ahern's resignation as well. But of course, it's done nothing to stop dodgy planning in general around the country, nothing at all. And also, if you drive Braywards, you'll see that it did very little to stop the devastation of the former beauty spot that was Cherrywood. So I guess that was my first induction into the processes of power and politics, and it wasn't a positive one. The lesson seemed to be that influence rested with those with money who could manipulate councillors, elected representatives at the local level, and who could act in the teeth of democracy, even where it had been stirred up and become manifest on a very large scale, because the campaign was very big and everyone was aware of the issues. So people power seemed to count for little enough. So some years later, having campaigned on a number of environmental issues, I became chairman of An Taisce, whose remit, as I interpreted it anyway, was to take the public interest stance in planning and environmental matters. And I suppose there were very simple lessons from getting stuck into monitoring planning applications, the planning process countrywide. It's totally clear that while there are documents, both at a local level and at a national level, that have a democratic imprimatur, and most of which are quite progressive, that in fact local representatives leaning on the officials in local authorities totally flout these reasonably clear visions of what should be done across the board and in particular cases. So the documentation looks very good. The documentation has the democratic mandate of councillors going through a process of consultation with the public, but the reality on the ground is totally different. And just to take in a couple of different examples, in Dublin City, the development plan says no high-rise, but the local authority constantly is pushing through high-rise, and in fact you have a process that Bord Pleanála, which actually pays attention to the official documentation, then overturns every time the local authority decisions. And then if you take a totally different phenomenon, the one-off housing phenomenon, every development plan in the country says that there should be major restrictions on one-off housing, but in fact most counties, literally most counties outside of the cities, allow development of the order of 60 or 70% of development in the form of one-off housing. So that's a very sharp lesson in how democracy is torpedoed by lobbying, both corporate and individual. In Dublin City, it's typically corporations lobbying officials and councillors, and elsewhere it's actually members of the public, members of the public with the economic power to develop often one-off housing who lobby very vigorously and aggressively. Another thing that I got involved with that will be, which Niamh I'm sure knows all about, was Docklands. In April 2007 I complained in a lengthy written submission to the Standards in Public Office Commission about Sean Fitzpatrick and Laura Bradshaw's involvements in Docklands. They were taking decisions as members of the Docklands Authority on issues like density, height, social housing, the amount of green space that was in parkland that was required at ground level. In other words, issues that affected the profitability from a developer's point of view of particular developments. But at the same time, they were bankers to a majority of those developments. And it seemed to me that there was an undesirable conflict of interest. Certainly there was a conflict of interest. The issue was whether it was legal and I suppose ethical. Anyway, Sean Fitzpatrick went ballistic on the media after this complaint was launched, talking about corporate McCarthyism. Pity there wasn't a little bit more of it probably. But unfortunately the complaint was the Standards and Public Office Commission adjudicated against it on the ground that the nexus between mere board members of a bank, employees of a bank, and on the one hand, and property developers of sites whose financing depended on the banks was not adequate to ground an adverse finding. I think they probably would have, if they were deciding it today, have decided it somewhat differently. But anyway, my conclusion at the time was that there was an influential golden circle, but that nobody cared about the conflicts of interest for the rich in Boomtown, Ireland. Another issue I got involved with was the Millennium Mall, the Carlton site on O'Connell Street. An architect called Paul Clinton put together a site involving 10 or 15 buildings which he proposed to develop as the Millennium Mall. And shortly after he put the plan together, he was assailed by developers. Unfortunately, I'm incautious enough usually to name these people. Anyway, Treasury Holdings told him that they wanted to be taken on as joint venture partners, or that they'd ensure that he would. He alleges that Treasury Holdings told him that they wanted to be taken on as joint venture partners on the scheme, or they'd ensure he was refused planning, appeal him through the courts all the way to Europe, and eventually get him compulsorily purchased. They boasted of influence in the corporation, but I suppose they would, wouldn't they? So Paul Clinton decided he wouldn't take them on as partners, and his development was indeed thwarted. He was taken to the High and Supreme Courts by the corporation, and only just before they CPO'd him was he bought out by Dundrum Shopping Centre developer Joe O'Reilly. So he spent 13 years trying to develop this site and was in the end thwarted. It's not that the scheme was particularly outstanding, but the lesson from that, I suppose, was that it seems that some developers have more clout than others. Even while he was, even when he owned the site, one of the most extraordinary things was that Treasury Holdings, when they were negotiating for this joint venture agreement, got the City Council to produce a plan on official corporation plan for the site, which plan was designed by Treasury Holdings architects. So you can imagine how Paul Clinton felt about this, that he owned the site. Treasury Holdings had no interest in it, and the corporation were officially supporting this plan by parties who had no interest in the site. I'm open, as I say, to questions, and if there's a particular direction that we'd like to take it, then I'm happy to go in that direction. It's maybe interesting to look actually at what the regime is here. I think that's probably something that we could spend some time looking at. I suppose most people accept that lobbying is legitimate. On some level, decision makers need information, though of course there is an issue as to whether vested interests are the best place to provide that information. But most people feel that transparency and accountability are appropriate mitigators of the obvious dangers, and that lobbying in itself shouldn't be precluded, provided that officials dealing with lobbyists adopt policies of selflessness, integrity and honesty, is what the UK's Nolan report recommended. Some people actually, there is a credible justification for not registering lobbyists. In the UK, the Nolan Committee said that lobbying, or creating a register of lobbyists, risks suggesting that lobbying by unregistered interests, including the public, was somehow of lesser moment and status and importance. But I would have thought that could be dealt with by simply making it very clear that there's no heightened status given to the lobbyings of registered lobbies. In Ireland, since the mid-1990s, stricter ethical requirements have been introduced for those who are lobbied, i.e. politicians and officials, who must now furnish statements of donations, make declarations of interest and adhere to codes of conduct for office holders. In other words, in Ireland at the moment, emphasis is on the lobbied rather than on the lobbyists. The 1997 programme for government commits to a register, with, unlike in Britain, where the Tories are officially against a register. But so far there have been no moves to actually introduce the register. It's implicit that the register that the government, if it actually did legislate for it, would be a voluntary register. Fine Gael and the Labour Party propose a compulsory register. There's a wide variety of different approaches worldwide. A 2006 study for the Department of the Environment established that only Canada, the USA, Germany and the EU had regulated lobbying at all, which is probably something of a surprise. Maybe we're all aware that there's a lot of control in the States, but there isn't in the majority of the other jurisdictions. I was going to go through the possible list of people who might be deemed to influence policy as opposed to be the beneficiaries of policy. Obviously, the media are a potentially important one. The stance taken by the Sunday Independent is one that's attracted a lot of attention. It can be very personal and single-minded. In 1994, Bertie Ahern changed the rules on how long tax exiles need to spend outside the country in a way that suited Tony O'Reilly and a limited number of other individuals. and also around the same time the tax rules were changed in ways that facilitated Tony O'Reilly's successful bid for Aircom. Matt Cooper, in his recent book, describes how Tony O'Reilly's desk was a solitary photo, which is of Tony and Bertie, and of how Bertie wanted to. It's generally accepted that Bertie wanted to appoint. Sorry, that Tony O'Reilly, had he survived, wanted to appoint Bertie to the board of independent newspapers when he retired. I think a lot of people accept that the stance of the Sunday Independent on Fianna Fáil is somewhat erratic, and we could probably establish some sort of a correlation between the editorial stances in the Sunday Independent. The policy shift in Fianna Fáil and editorial stances in this Sunday Independent. A lot of people say social partners are very influential. Senior civil servants are obviously a very influential group. In general, I think it's accepted that the ethos of the Department of Finance has spread to the regulator, and the central bank was very keen on light touch regulation. So that whole trajectory was, to a significant extent, promoted by the Department of Finance and the officials who went from there to other places. My own interest is the Department of the Environment, and my contacts in the Green Party when filled with alcohol, which isn't a particular tendency of the Green Party members, but they moan about how the civil service outmanoeuvres them when they're trying to introduce radical or innovative legislation. That many of the minister's most radical initiatives are simply delayed until heart is lost. It seems to me that shouldn't be possible, that a minister with a democratic mandate in those circumstances should be able to lean on the officials to stop it, but that does seem to be a characteristic of the Greens' frustrations in government. Multinationals clearly are very influential in keeping corporation tax down, pushing particular infrastructural developments, including the billions that have been spent on roads. It also seems they've got the keen ear of government on education. Famously, a meeting was convened last year with involving senior people in Google and Intel and Hewlett Packard, and Pat O'Keefe was told that grade inflation would be our ruination, and inevitably that leapt to. I guess developers are widely accepted to be, a lot of our problems have originated from the lobbyings of developers, and we need to go no further than Bertie Ahern himself to get the real story in this. In May he said that the government should have abolished property-based tax incentives earlier, but faced what he described as fierce pressure from developers and politicians not to do so. We probably should have closed those down a good bit earlier, but there were always fierce pressures. There was endless pressures to keep them, there was endless pressures to extend them. Asked who exerted the pressure, Mr. Ahern said, developers, owners of sites, areas that didn't have the developments, community councils, politicians, civic society, they were forever at us. They'd be coming to see Cow and deputations right across, and that's part, I suppose, of democratic politics. That's delayed them down. Banks, obviously, it's mysterious how the banks, so many scandals associated with the banks dating back to Anne's back, and I think there was a guy called Ken Bates. Should have been far tighter regulation a generation ago of the banks. Simon Johnson, former chief economist at the IMF, said in the New York Times last week that Ireland could have, his overall view was that Ireland could have acknowledged insolvency and required creditors to share some of the burden. Writing in the New York Times, he said that a strong lobby of real estate developers, the investors who bought bank bonds, and politicians with links to the failed developments, and their bankers prefer that taxpayers rather than creditors pay. Okay, I am running out of time, so maybe it's, I did have quite a bit to say.
Could you say just a little about your own organisation? It's not familiar to everyone here, and it does seem to be at the tiniest chink of light in the otherwise dark sea.
Well, I'm not really, so the organisation I was involved with for the longest was Unfashionable and Tashka, but I'm now editor of Village magazine, which is
Transparency International.
Transparency International, sorry. Yes. But I'm not. I'm just one of 6 or 7 members on the board of Transparency International. But it essentially takes policy positions against corruption and in favour of integrity in the political process. It's quite a small organisation with limited funding. It's open to the public. It's not. I think it's been mooted that it has some sort of strange agenda, but it just has a mainstream anti-corruption, pro-transparency agenda. It's open to members of the public to join and to get onto the board as well. I did want to talk about lobbying in the European Union. In the European Union, there is a register for the Parliament, compulsory register for the Parliament, but there's only a voluntary register for the Commission, where most of the detail of legislation is installed, and it's very clear that the registrations are inadequate. They don't give enough details, and not enough people register. You can see that in the States that a far wider range of interest groups or of companies are registered as lobbyists. There's no reason to think they're not lobbying in Brussels, but they seem to do an awful lot of it through industry groups. And bearing in mind the purported interest of the European in transparency, it does seem extraordinary that they shouldn't be promoting a compulsory register of interests for the Commission, which of course originates all legislation. So overall, I suppose my conclusion, having immersed myself in this stuff for a few days, is that there's a need for compulsory registers of lobbyists, both in Ireland and in Europe, and that the information that once they've registered they should be required to disclose should be as wide-ranging as possible. Thank you very much.